Well, good morning. This is Scott with ReadySquirrel.com. Today I'm going to discuss an article that I wrote, and I will put a link down below on how to make your own yeast, also called starter. It's how people have been making bread for thousands of years. It's actually the yeast packets are actually kind of a modern occurrence. So I had a 50 pounds of white flour in my basement as part of my food storage, long-term food storage. It's not something that we use in our regular diet. I've got teenagers that don't like to eat carbs, and that's kind of boiled over into the rest of the family and how we eat. So anyway, the virus that shall remain nameless came along. We had lockdowns. I'm on the East Coast. I'm 60 miles from 8.3 million people in New York City. And the grocery stores had rationing, and they started running out of stuff. And one of the things they didn't have was yeast. So I scrambled around. I just happened to look up making your own yeast and started doing some research on it. And it turns out, well, all you need is flour and water to make yeast. There are some rules involved with it, but it's totally doable. So if you don't want to listen to me yak, you can go over to ReadySquirrel.com, or you can click the link down below, and it'll take you directly to the article where there is a downloadable PDF with the instructions on it. Okay, so let's make this simple. How to make yeast, step-by-step instructions. You got to make sure that your container is clean. This is a simple way to do it. Like, you can weigh your ingredients equal weight on a scale and combine them. You can also do it that way to make a starter. This is for somebody that needs to make bread. They don't have yeast. This is a way that you can get things rolling. So how to make yeast, step-by-step instructions. Clean the container. Place 3 tablespoons of flour in the jar. Add 2 tablespoons of unchlorinated water. Unchlorinated because bleach kills the microorganisms that are going to create the yeast for you. Stir that concoction. Cover it lightly. You do want some oxygen to get in the container. You don't want it to be anaerobic. Store it in a cool, dark place, and you're going to repeat steps 2 to 4. So every day you're going to put 3 tablespoons of flour in a jar, 2 tablespoons of unchlorinated water, and you're going to stir it. You're going to do that every day for 3 to 5 days. And eventually it's going to start bubbling. 5 days is sufficient for pancakes if you want to create a strong starter. For fluffy bread, you want to go, I'm going to say 10 days to 2 weeks if you really want to get this stuff rocking. What equipment do you need to make yeast? I used a 32-ounce ball jar, but honestly, I think you could actually do it in a big glass, like a big plastic glass or something like that, and then just partially cover it with cellophane. Like it doesn't really matter what the container is as long as it's clean. Use distilled or filtered water. Again, chlorine kills yeast. Flour, any kind will do. I used white unbleached flour, and I used a couple of other whole grain flours, and they all seem to work fine. Use a measuring spoon and a stirring device. You have to maintain your yeast after the first 5 to 10 days or however long you're going to wait to use it. I stored my yeast at room temperature, and I got kind of sloppy with it, to be honest with you. Like, I'd use heaping tablespoons, and sometimes I'd put in 3 tablespoons of water if I thought it was getting too thick. It's pretty forgiving, because basically what you're doing every day when you're putting that yeast and water in is once it gets started, is you're feeding the yeast. So if you want to go, you can continue to do the tablespoon method, or you can do by weight a 1-to-1 ratio water to flour. And where that comes to play is if, let's say, you wanted to make 5 loaves of bread and you need X amount of starter, and down below I have a recipe on how to actually make the bread. And the reason I did that was, so I learned how to make the starter, and then I'm like, oh, I don't know how to use this. You know, if you're making a regular recipe with dry yeast, it's pretty simple. But when you're using starter, there's a little bit more art to it. The bread may not come out perfect depending on how much yeast you have in the starter, but you're going to have an edible bread. So it's a process, and it's a skill that you're going to learn. One other thing about this is it is sourdough. The starter is sourdough, but that the whole idea of getting like this awesome sourdough bread, with some artisanal bread, the professional bakers try really hard to get that super sourdough flavor. That is not something that's simple to attain. So I made 5 loaves of bread with the first starter that I made, and there was a slightly sour flavor, but hardly at all. So it was like hardly noticeable. So if you don't like sourdough bread, I still suggest that you try this. You're going to know that your yeast is getting active when it starts to bubble. And it smells like vinegar, but I don't think that it does smell like vinegar. I should probably change that. It smells kind of sweet sour. And it says if your starter gets nasty, you'll know if this happens. Just throw it out and start over. I forgot about my starter for 3 weeks, didn't feed it, and it created a hard coat on top of the leaven or the starter. I took that hard shell off, fed it, and the yeast went right back to work. So I think the times and the dates are a little bit forgiving. You can test and you can play with that. Again, so go back to room temperature. You want to feed your yeast like every day or every other day. I think in the beginning you want to do it every day until you get it pumping. And then if you're doing it in the refrigerator to maintain it, you want to feed it once a week. Again, you'll know if your yeast is getting active because it'll start to bubble. And how do you make a lot of yeast starter? I guess we kind of already talked about this, but you just weigh the ingredients on a scale. I'm not going to give you specific instructions here, but you need to zero the scale out with whatever it is you're using to stir the ingredients on so that you're just weighing the weight of water and flour. So a leavening agent, what you're doing when you're creating the starter is you're basically creating something that will lighten or make the bread raise and soften. And there are so many versions of unleavened bread. So if you don't get an awesome leaven out of this with the first couple times you use it because you can't wait long enough to get that going, you're still going to have an edible bread. And I've actually taken the excess of my starter and fried it in a pan and chopped up some fresh chives out of the garden and eaten them for lunch. So some people actually throw their extra leavening out because you're feeding it every day. It just grows, and you'll get to a point where you start running out of room. So instead of throwing it out, you may want to consider actually making something with it. What's the story behind homemade yeast? Dates back to the Egyptians, and I'm not going to read all that. If you want to, you can go over and check out the article. Why should I make a sourdough or yeast starter? You don't have commercial yeast, which is why I initially did this. I needed to make bread, and I didn't have any yeast. And sometimes it may not be available to store, or you can't get there. I guess that's a possibility. This would actually also be awesome if you're living off-grid somewhere like in Alaska or someplace like that. The bread stores longer for some reason when you make your own yeast. When you make your own starter, the flour is pre-digested by the natural fermentation process, which I'm not saying this is gluten-free, but it actually reduces the gluten. Flavor, that's where I see the difference. Wow. This bread, if you like a nutty tasting bread and you actually like crust on good bread, wow. Then it's a no-brainer to make your own bread. Nutrients in the bread are more bioavailable just due to the critters that you use to raise the bread. It's a little conversation of why I wrote the article. And then here, let's make some bread with our yeast starter. So there is a simple recipe here to make bread. And that was my intention when I did this article, the questions that I had. It's like, okay, I have the starter now how do I use it? So this article is short, it's to the point, and it's usable. You could actually print this out. Again, you can find the downloadable PDF on the website. Follow the link. And you could put this in your emergency folder, so if the day comes along and you need to make your own yeast, you've actually got directions. So talked in here also about how to measure baking ingredients by weight with a small kitchen scale. I have one of those battery operated scales that I use. Shows you how to zero it out, or tells you rather. And then there's a little article here on how to remove chlorine from water. I'm lucky in that I'm on a clean well with good water. But if you're not, you can actually use Camden tablets, which are used by brewers to remove chlorine and chloramine, and you can read about that also. Okay, so that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this article. I hope it's helpful. Check us out when you get a chance at ReadySquirrel.com. Again, thanks for listening and have a great day.